I'm Kim McCleary, President and CEO of the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. Thank you all so very much for joining us today. Today is Giving Tuesday, a day that celebrates generosity, kindness, and unity. In this year of unprecedented uncertainty for small mission-driven nonprofits like ours, you can make a direct impact on our future. As a nonpartisan organization, our mission is to foster civic engagement and build programs that bring people together from around the world around the most compelling issues. This diversity of views presented by experts and leaders in their field is needed now more than ever before in this very polarized world. Please support us today. With your support, we will be able to continue to serve you and our global community. Thank you so much. It is now my great pleasure, to introduce today's program, U.S. Relations with South Korea and Japan, with Marc Knapper, who is Deputy Assistant Secretary for Korea and Japan at the U.S. Department of State, and Dr. John Park, who will be moderating today's program. Dr. Park is Director of the Korea Project at Harvard's Kennedy School's Belfer Center. He is also a Senior Fellow at the University of Southern California's Korean Studies Institute. I would also like to thank the Korea Foundation, who are sponsors of today's program. They were a wonderful partner to work with in helping us put together today's program. With that, Dr. Park, it's time for me to turn the program over to you and Mr. Knapper. We're looking forward to a very interesting conversation.
Thank you very much. I'd like to express my thanks to Kim and the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall team for a terrific event today. It's my honor to introduce Deputy Assistant Secretary Marc Knapper. Marc is a distinguished leader in the Senior Foreign Service who has completed postings in South Korea, Japan, Vietnam, and Iraq. Earlier in his career, he worked on negotiations with North Korea. Marc is a graduate of Princeton University and the U.S. Army War College. Most notably, he originally hails from Southern California. Welcome, Marc. To set the stage here, the U.S. has enjoyed robust alliances with South Korea and Japan. The three countries have advanced mutual political, economic, and security interests through two remarkable bilateral alliances. We'll examine today how these countries are working to address challenges ranging from China to North Korea, as well as COVID to trade tensions, and security threats here. To start off, Marc, I wanted to turn it to you. Before we jump into this session, I'm very curious for your own path from Southern California to the world stage of diplomacy. What sparked your interest in diplomacy?
Well, thanks, John, and let me add my thanks as well to the LA World Affairs Council and Town Hall organizers. This has been a really well put together event. Very, very grateful for this invitation, and of course, grateful as well to the Korea Foundation for their support, and to you as well, John, for moderating today. Just ask that you be gentle with me over the next hour. But no, you ask a great question, and I think for me, I grew up in Los Angeles. I attended Loyola High School, for those of you out there who are familiar with it. And I think my interest in diplomacy and in the Indo-Pacific, the Asia-Pacific, really was sparked by growing up in Southern California, which is such a diverse place in which to live. And so many of my friends, their families originally hailed from countries on the Pacific Rim, whether it was Korea or Japan or elsewhere. And so I really did appreciate the diversity of my environment as a young person. And then my father was in the Marine Corps, and so I think that also encouraged me to go down the path of public service. And I had just always been interested in international relations and in foreign policy. And so all of these kind of came together in a really unique way, and inspired me to pursue a career in the U.S. diplomatic service.
That's fantastic, very helpful. I mean, in terms of one aspect, that connection to the Asia Pacific, it certainly comes through a lot here. Marc, I mean, one start to our conversation is the big elephant in the room. And these days, a lot of conversations end up focusing about China, for better or for worse. So to start this portion of it, I'm curious, how does this confrontational tone of U.S.-China bilateral relations impact relations among the United States, South Korea, and Japan? And what specific challenges, opportunities do you see?
Well, thanks. I mean, I think first of all, we recognize both Japan and South Korea have very complex, very nuanced relations with the People's Republic of China, intense trading ties, other ties, and so certainly, I think we're not asking to contain China or to cut them off, but rather our goal is for our allies like Japan and Korea, countries with whom we share values, countries with whom we share democratic principles, to stand up for these principles, stand up for these values, and together, really, when we see bad behavior from China, to call it out and to stand together as democracies to really to not accept what the kind of malign activities that we see. I mean, just the other day, for example, we saw Chinese Foreign Ministry representative tweet out a really offensive, doctored photograph of an Australian soldier with an Afghan child. I mean, it was completely fake, but this is an official government website putting this out. And so, I mean, these kind of things really are unacceptable. And I think we, with our Japanese and our Korean allies and others, really have to stand up and do recognize when we see bad behavior.
With that, some other areas, I guess, troubling developments, with the pattern that we're seeing is coercion on the economic side. And we've seen a precedent of this with respect to how China is using economic coercion on neighboring countries. We've seen that in South Korea over the THAAD, the ballistic missile defense system there. We've also seen it with Australia and restrictions on their wine exports to China. Japan, back in the period where there were disputes over the Diaoyu Senkaku Islands and the particular fishery dispute there, and restrictions from China on rare earth elements exports to Japan. And then the Philippines on agricultural exports to China as well. Specifically in that context, how do these damaging measures affect these countries, and what can the U.S. and its allies do in response to these growing practices on the economic coercion side by China?
For sure, and it's actually not just countries in the Asia Pacific. I mean, there was an instance several years ago in which Norway, after awarding the Nobel Peace Prize to a Chinese dissident, all of a sudden China boycotted imports from Norway of salmon, and which is a huge product coming from Norway. And so China doesn't limit this kind of economic coercion to its neighbors. It's a worldwide, fortunately, worldwide phenomenon. And I think, again, this falls into the category of seeing, we see this kind of behavior that we have to band together. I just saw yesterday there's an International Parliamentary Association which put out an announcement calling on its members to purchase Australian wine, to make a special effort to buy Australian wine in the face of this Chinese imposition of tariffs, I guess. And so, really, I think it's the first step is recognizing when we do see this kind of activity, and then as democracies, as open and transparent societies, sticking together and working together. One aspect of China's Belt and Road Initiative is to give these sweetheart or apparently sweetheart deals to developing countries. We've seen this in Sri Lanka, we've seen it in Pakistan, which ends up saddling these countries with terribly burdensome debt. In fact, there's a term for it. It's called debt trap diplomacy. And so right now, we and Japan, for instance, are working together on developing alternatives for nations in the region to this kind of debt trap diplomacy, alternatives such that when they do pursue infrastructure projects and when they do pursue efforts to and other development efforts, that they can look to the private sector, they can look to development finance coming out of Japan, whether it's the Japanese JBIC, the Japan Bank of International Cooperation, whether it's the U.S., what used to be called OPIC, and now is the International Development Finance Corporation. But these are efforts to harness the power of the private sector and work with these countries such that investment and assistance can be provided to help them to develop their infrastructure in a way that doesn't burden them with this very punishing debt load.
I mean, sticking with the economic and trade side of it, recent development in the region, we've had the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement signed. And, very noticeably, the United States is absent from that. What are the implications for the United States not being a part of RCEP or any regional trade affiliation right now?
Well, I mean, this administration made the decision early on that it would pursue bilateral trade agreements versus multilateral ones. And so we've seen success in this area. We've seen success with a revision of the Korea-US Free Trade Agreement. We've seen success with phase one of a US-Japan Free Trade Agreement. Of course, there have been other bilateral trade agreements, not just in the Indo-Pacific, but around the world. And so, well, certainly, RCEP is being pursued by many of our partners and allies. It's a decision we've made not to participate in these multilateral arrangements.
How do you see that changing? With the Biden administration coming in, what do you see in terms of the regional approach? I mean, in the campaign trail, there was a focus on multilateral, and it seems that with this transition, multilateral, would there be a revisiting of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP?
I've got to be, John, I got to be careful since I can't really speak on behalf of the incoming administration. Probably pretty cross with me if I did. I know my current bosses would be, so I'm going to have to sidestep that kind of question, I'm afraid.
We'll table that for later. Thanks for that, Marc. So this is, I think, a good period to transition. This is something that we now have a global common focus, and that's the COVID challenge and economic recovery being an area where, irrespective of political systems and whatnot, there is this common challenge that we're all confronting right now. Clearly, this is going to be a dominant domestic factor for all countries, and specifically the countries in the region and the countries that you focus on. Can you elaborate a little more? So, what are the implications here of the domestic focus on COVID recovery among the three countries, the United States, South Korea, and Japan?
Well, I mean, we've seen just over the last 8-9 months of the pandemic, one thing that really stands out is how we as allies were able to band together and support each other sort of across the entire spectrum of the COVID response, whether it was helping each other in terms of providing PPE, whether it was, there's a great example of South Korea prioritizing to the United States the provision of 750,000 test kits. We've seen great cooperation between American researchers and then Japanese counterparts, Korean counterparts, in terms of not just therapeutics, but the vaccines, other treatments, sharing data, sharing actual sort of samples of potential drugs. I mean, this has been really a terrific example of how we have built this muscle memory over the decades, working together, collaborating on various things, and now it's really it's been very easy for us to work together over the past 8 or 9 months. There was one instance when we've had, for example, American citizens, in Central Asia or in Africa, they couldn't get home, but there happened to be a Japanese flight bringing Japanese folks out who were just, they allowed Americans to join, they allowed Koreans to join these flights, and vice versa. And so really, it's the kind of cooperation that we've worked on, we've trained for, and it really did come to full fruition over the past 8 or 9 months. And going forward, I would expect to see the same. I think developing sort of shared approaches to pandemic responses, I think is going to be a major feature of our national security policies going forward. Certainly, it's something I think that you're hearing a lot about here in the United States, that national security is more than just the defense budget, but really it's got to include forecasting and dealing with pandemics. And the same is going to be true in other countries, certainly like Japan and Korea. And the more that we can collaborate, share information, share data, share intelligence, I think the better we'll be, because of course, in this day and age, I mean, pandemics and other transnational problems know no boundaries. And so the better we're able to work together, the better we and the entire world will be off.
So, I mean, the silver lining of that, certainly these are great opportunities for the type of enhanced cooperation, and it's been remarkable, as you mentioned, those examples I think are really good highlights and hallmarks of the types of relationships that we have. But shifting gears here to another tough topic, and that's North Korea. And North Korea, specifically the process to deal with North Korea, because it is a chronic issue, specifically in the area of the security challenge. Trump era diplomacy, we see almost this consensus emerging that trying top-down diplomacy, leader-to-leader contact and negotiations and summits was a step in the right direction, and that was something that was good to try. And I understand the delicacy of this question, so please approach it from any angle that you feel you can. But I think audience members will be curious, like what key elements of what we just saw with the Trump era diplomacy should we seek to continue going forward?
Well, so I was living in South Korea from 2015 to 2018, serving in our embassy there, and really did see kind of both extremes of the U.S. relationship with the North. On the one hand, throughout most of 2017, we had fire and fury, very intense rhetoric going both ways. We had two ICBM tests. We had North Korea's 6th nuclear test. Pretty high tension, pretty scary times for sure. But then in 2018, we saw the opposite of the spectrum. We saw some outreach from the North in Kim Jong-un's New Year's statement in January of 2018. We saw, of course, North Korean participation in the Pyeongchang Olympics. We saw the summit with Moon Jae-in and Kim Jong-un. Of course, we had our own summit with President Trump in Singapore later that year. And so I really do credit, I credit the top-down approach, as you said, to creating this breakthrough. And for the last, we haven't had an ICBM launch in 3 years. We just passed the 3-year anniversary, in fact, of the North's final North ICBM launch. We haven't had a nuclear test since September of 2017. And so these are good things. But more work needs to be done. As we often say publicly, certainly, the door to diplomacy with the North remains open. We want nothing more than a peaceful resolution of the nuclear issue and addressing their missile issue. Of course, very important to us is the issue of the Japanese abductee issue, which is something that we constantly press the North on. The resolution of the 12 Japanese who remain abducted in North Korea. And so these are issues, we've been working on them for many years. I know you're aware, we've been since the 90s and throughout, but this is a critical issue for our country. It's a critical issue for the region, for our allies and our alliances, and it's absolutely something that remains a high priority for us.
I think we have a rare opportunity with you, Marc. As I did my calculation from your State Department biography, it's almost 20 years that you've had interactions dealing with the North Korea challenge. And from that 20-year time period, I'd just be curious what your observations are in terms of how things have been playing out with respect to North Korea, specifically on the security issue.
Well, actually, I'm a bit longer than 20 years. I was in South Korea for my very first assignment in the State Department, so 1993. And of course, in 94, we had the agreed framework. Fast forward to 2000, we had, that's when Madeleine Albright visited North Korea. We had Kim Jong-il had his summit with Kim Dae-jung, the then South Korean president. And so definitely, if I had to sort of look back, it's been a lot of ups and downs, and it's sort of been a lot of signs of hope, then dashed by signs of just increased, not signs, but dashed by actual, increased tensions between and among all the parties concerned. But it's the one, I think the one constant though has been, well, two things. I think two constants have been the great coordination and collaboration we've enjoyed with our allies in the region, whether it's South Korea, whether it's Japan, whether it's others from time to time. But it's been really a solid and steady, I think, thread that the U.S. and our allies have worked intensely close together. And I think the other constant really has been, very specific to the U.S. and South Korea, but it's been the strength of our alliance and really the continuity of our commitment to our security treaty, the continuity of our really solemn obligation to deter North Korean aggression, and if heaven forbid, to defend if there were ever another attack. But these are the constants, and I think our diplomacy has to rest on our alliances and has to rest on our great collaboration and our great cooperation with these two great friends and allies.
So the aspect of the alliance is it has been a remarkable influence on the stabilization of a crisis, a lingering crisis. I mean, juxtaposing that, what are some of your observations related to China during that time period? And as you pointed out, from the early 1990s, you have, I think, a very unique vantage point of being on the ground in the country at that time, in the region at that time, and also continuing to deal with these challenges over the years as well. Any particular things that stick out in terms of how China's role in dealing with the North Korea challenge has evolved over that time as well?
Yeah, I mean, certainly China as one of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council has a very special, unique responsibility in terms of dealing with the North Korean issue. I mean, how many UN Security Council resolutions have there been over the years? And I think as a steward of these resolutions, China, together with the other permanent members, really has to step up and enforce the various sanctions and other activities to pressure North Korea. But as my State Department colleague Alex Wong, in a speech this morning, described, China really hasn't been living up to its commitments under the Security Council resolutions, and there have been so many instances of under China's nose items being illegally transferred, whether it's North Korean coal being illegally exported from North Korea, or whether it's refined petroleum being illegally imported into North Korea. I mean, these are all instances that China really can and has to do more. So I think on the one hand, we recognize that any solution, any solution to the North Korean issue, requires good cooperation with China. I mean, this is one of these issues that we do need China to do more, frankly. And so I think we're going to continue to publicly and privately, try and impress upon the Chinese the need for them to step up and honor their special responsibility as a UN Security Council permanent member.
With that, the other element is how both South Korea and Japan, when they look at their own security, the China piece comes up again. And just look at it from a slightly different angle. Your area of focus as a Deputy Assistant Secretary for Korea and Japan is unique because these are 2 extraordinary alliances that the United States has. It has, as you mentioned earlier, been not only a symbol, but also, I think, in many respects, the deepening and in many cases, the expansion of democratic values in Asia. But when you look at the trilateral configuration, these are 2 alliances, and there has been aspirationally a hope that it would be a trilateral configuration. What's the latest update, Marc, in terms of efforts on the Seoul and Tokyo part of this trilateral, design and architecture?
Well, thanks, and you're right. I mean, I do feel really, uniquely positioned, blessed, I think, to be able to work day to day on these 2 great relationships, these 2 great alliances we have. And for sure, I think sort of tucked within your question there is really the realization that things right now between Seoul and Tokyo aren't as good as they could be. There's been issues over the past few years which have I think undermined the kind of productive and constructive relations that I think all of us recognize should be between Japan and Korea and among our 3 countries. Of course, there are issues related to history and particularly the colonial history. And there are issues related to trade and other matters. but really, I mean, it's the history issues that remain thorny. They have over the past, several years. And this is something ultimately that Seoul and Tokyo have to address on their own. The United States certainly, heaven knows, we have our own history issues that we deal with still within our own country, and so it's not for us to tell one or the other, like, get over it and move forward. They have to do it in a way that's satisfactory to their own peoples, and in a way that promotes reconciliation, in a way that hopefully promotes a brighter path forward. But in the meantime, the United States, we will continue to encourage trilateral cooperation. We will continue to encourage better relations between Seoul and Tokyo. To the extent that we can, we could play a convening role, bringing our three countries together to talk about. Very often, it is North Korea, since that is the one issue that we all share a keen interest in, and critical sort of national security matters. But there are many other things that I think that we three countries can sit down and talk about. One of them is, for example, related to what we had talked about at the very beginning of this conversation, and that's how can we work together to promote things like development assistance, infrastructure development in the region, in a way that doesn't undermine the finances and sort of best practices and rule of law in the neighbors in the region, whether it's Sri Lanka or Pakistan or in Southeast Asia. Definitely, I mean, all three of us are already doing work in these areas, and so in an era of limited resources, it makes sense for us to pool our efforts and ensure that we're not just doing things that are redundant or overlapping. So yeah, we'll continue to do our best to play a positive role, and certainly not mediate or not get in the middle or not try to intervene. But I think, under the behind the scenes or under the surface, whatever. I mean, definitely there are things we do regularly, not often visible to the public or to the press, but certainly just because we say we're not getting in the middle of it doesn't mean we're disinterested. Doesn't mean we don't care. We absolutely care, because positive, good Japan-Korea, South Korea relations are absolutely in the interest of the United States, and it's something that we will continue to push for. And this effort goes way back. I remember in 2000, in the late 90s, we had efforts underway to coordinate trilaterally, and it's been something that's been a feature of our relations now, for decades.
I mean, it's a testament, and I think a debt of gratitude from us to you and your diplomatic colleagues in South Korea and Japan, and continuing to work very difficult issues. But certainly the layers of institutions and relationships certainly do matter. Before I turn it over to Jessica for questions from the audience, I wanted to ask one final question, Marc, as a part of our warm-up session here. And it's about the Quad. The Quad is really one area that is unique in that it spans different administrations and it spans the political spectrum. This is one unique area in many respects that has that wide appeal. The configuration of the Quad with the United States, Australia, Japan, and India certainly doesn't mean that it's limited to the Quad. But how do you see the Quad going forward? This is a key part of, I think, investment of a lot of political capital. What do you see as the next steps forward related to the Quad in the region, Asia Pacific?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I mean, the Quad, as you noted, I mean, it's spanned different administrations. Its initial kind of inception was in 2004, after the December 26th earthquake and tsunami in the Indian Ocean, Southeast Asia. It was our four countries that were kind of right out of the blocks, India, Japan, Australia, United States, to provide disaster relief, humanitarian assistance to the countries affected, from Indonesia to Sri Lanka, and of course many others, Thailand. And so that was the initial sort of grouping that came together at that time. And over the years, it's waxed and waned. And I think now you're seeing we're in a period of waxing, in which really the four countries, I think, have concluded that we do have shared interests, we do have shared challenges in the region, we do have shared values. I mean, the common denominator of all four of us is liberal, open democracies that share an interest in free and open sea lanes, share an interest in unfettered trade, share an interest in ensuring that data is able to flow freely but also securely around the region, across the globe. So but just because these four countries have found themselves together, doesn't mean it's an exclusive club. It doesn't mean we're insular and refusing to deal with others. By all means, I mean we do. I think we will see a time when there'll be opportunities to include other like-minded countries. Absolutely, Korea I foresee is being able to join our efforts, but I don't see in the immediate or immediate future sort of a NATO or a kind of secretariat being or the institutionalization of this grouping. It really is more of a kind of a concept, a shared concept of how and whether and how we should work together. And by all means, if there are other countries that can join our efforts, I think it would be welcome.
Great. That's great laying of the context. I think now is a perfect time to transition to audience Q&A. Over to you, Jessica. Thank you, Mark.
Great, thank you so much. We have a lot of questions coming in, so I'll get right to it. Our first, should the US or is the US going to issue a formal statement on China's behavior towards our ally Australia, with other allies like Japan and the Republic of Korea?
Wow, that is a great question. I think at this point, all I can say is it's being worked right now. I think it's actually was the topic of a meeting we had this morning, but I cannot give you a sort of concrete answer. I apologize, but it's absolutely a very topical, excellent question, but one that I can't give you a firm response at this moment.
Thank you. Well, we'll keep an eye out for the articles. How important is linking economic concessions to DPRK, such as relief on sanctions on coal exports by DPRK, to denuclearization for progress on negotiations?
Well, I mean, we've said many times that that in order for North Korea to fully sort of rejoin the international community, and in order for North Korea to come out from under these sanctions, knows what to do. The international community. This isn't a U.S. thing. This is an international community thing. The international community came together and at the United Nations voted to impose a number of economic sanctions in order to send the message that North Korea's nuclear missile programs are unacceptable. And so, basically, it's very clear what North Korea needs to do, and while the door to diplomacy remains open, at the same time, our continued efforts to enforce these UN sanctions will also continue.
Thank you. There have been many articles lately about suicide killing more people in Japan than COVID, especially young women. Could you please explain this? Thank you.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm hesitant to try and, as a non-Japanese, I'm hesitant to try and speak about problems in another country, but it's a real tragedy. This high rate of suicides, not just in Japan, but other countries in the region. I mean, there's societal reasons, there are other reasons for sure, related to what's happening, and I do know that the government there takes this very seriously and is trying to provide the kind of psychosocial care needed to address the various stresses in normal daily life, and compounded, of course, by the stresses of coronavirus and the pandemic. But yeah, I mean, it's under any circumstances and in any society, that kind of suicides are just really just an unspeakable tragedy.
Thank you. Do you think that there is a need to expand the funding for the Development Finance Corporation in order to compete with China's influence through the Belt and Road Initiative?
Well, one of the when we transitioned from an organization called OPIC, Overseas Private Investment Corporation, to the DFC, the Development Finance Corporation, one of the big changes was, first of all, expanding the amount of funding available, but also, for example, allowing the money from the DFC to be used for feasibility studies, which hadn't been possible before. But ultimately, the goal of the DFC and our partners in, say, Japan with JBIC, Australia has its own sort of development finance institution, is to try to encourage the private sector to step in and unleash the power of, of, of corporations, not just in the United States, but Japan and elsewhere in the region to get behind some of these huge projects and potential strong investments. And hopefully it's this public money that will be the seed money, or would prime the pump, so to speak, to allow then, I think I saw a figure, there's $1 trillion of US investment alone in the Indo-Pacific. And so just that, trying to sort of harness that kind of private capital and to harness free markets rather than state-led capital, because we'll never be able to compete against the kind of money that the state, and the PRC is generating. But what we can do is bring the power and the wisdom of our free markets to bear on what's necessary to help develop in the Indo-Pacific.
Thank you. This is a bit of a follow-up to that. You mentioned debt trap diplomacy in China. Is China using this approach as it offers its COVID vaccine to several countries in Asia, South America, et cetera? What can Korea, Japan, and the USA do about this?
That's an interesting question. One thing we saw sort of over the last 8 or 9 months was something that was called mask diplomacy, which was the Chinese providing, Chinese government, let me say, be careful, it's the Chinese government, providing masks free of charge to countries throughout the world. There were instances, I think, like Czech Republic and others, Southeast Asia. And it turns out that, this was all part of this big effort to show that the PRC should be the partner of choice in dealing with the pandemic. But when they actually sort of opened the boxes and tried the masks out or tried the various things out, ventilators, whatever, it turns out they were quite kind of low quality and not very well made. So so that's not really an answer to the question. Who knows? I don't know. I can't say that we've seen anything yet regarding the use of the vaccine to try and strengthen. I have no doubt that if it'll be similar to mask diplomacy, maybe we'll call it vaccine diplomacy. But given what we saw with the subpar kind of shoddy PPE and other equipment that was sent around the world, I'm not sure I would be standing in line for a vaccine.
Thank you. What future prospects are there for six-party talks?
Well, right now, we are the six-party talks are kind of in hibernation. There is no plan at the moment to restart them. Right now, our focus is on working with our allies like Japan and South Korea, and working with others like Russia and China on our shared goals of denuclearization. But in terms of a formal grouping, no plans at this moment.
Thank you. What can you tell us about Prime Minister Abe's successor, Prime Minister Suga? What are his ambitions for Japan, and should we expect any major changes in our relations there?
Well, to start with the second question, I would say no. I think we know Prime Minister Suga very well from his time as Chief Cabinet Secretary, and even before then, when he was a senior member of the Diet of the ruling Liberal Democratic Party. We know that he's very committed, and his government is very committed to our alliance. Of course, one of the first, I think, interactions he had when he became Prime Minister was a telephone call with President Trump. When he was Chief Cabinet Secretary, Suga-san came to Washington and New York I think it was last May. And so he is very familiar with our alliance. He's very committed to our alliance. It's obvious to us. And so, our understanding is that, I think the minute, it will allow, we'd love to be able to welcome him to Washington. But certainly, we see him as a great partner and a great, leader committed to the U.S.-Japan alliance.
Thank you. What is your sense of why China supported the UN resolutions on sanctions on DPRK, only to breach them in practice?
That's a good question. Well, hard for me to speak on behalf of the PRC, but suffice to say, I mean, my understanding is that they don't desire a nuclear-armed North Korea on their border any more than we or Japan or South Korea does. As for allowing sanctions to be breached? I mean, again, that's a question maybe for others. John, if you've got thoughts, I'd welcome them. But certainly, we constantly it's not for lack of being called out by us. That's the point I'll make. I mean, we have regularly informed the Chinese when we become aware of sanctions breaches. We've regularly informed the Chinese government when we become aware of ship-to-ship transfers in the Yellow Sea or in the off the coast of China. And we've just seen too many instances of coal and refined petroleum falling through the cracks and basically generating income for North Korea's nuclear and missile programs. And so it's unacceptable. And so we'll continue to bring this up. As I mentioned this morning, just a couple hours ago, my colleague in the State Department, Alex Wong, gave 20, 30 minutes of remarks on this very subject. So I'd commend to you his remarks. They should be on the CSIS website, where he lays out in great specificity, what we've tried to do with China and what we've seen China doing or not doing, as the case may be.
I would just quickly add to that what Mark mentioned from the research community side. What we've noted is very consistent Chinese concern about the stability inside of the North Korean regime, and so one, and there are many different types of explanations that they give, but one that has been fairly consistent is, as they view it, the stability of the regime in North Korea is something that they don't want to interfere with, and their concern is that greater implementation of sanctions could potentially trigger inadvertent collapse. And there are also, it's something to keep in mind in the border region. There has been Chinese North Korean business enterprises, and so increasingly implementing sanctions against North Koreans affects some of the Chinese businesses as well on the local level. So myriad of issues, but the biggest one tends to be the concern on the Chinese leadership side of the regime stability inside of North Korea.
Thank you so much. Sorry, let me get back up to the top here. What role does Japan and South Korea play in Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Israel?
Well, both Japan and South Korea enjoy normal diplomatic relations with all three countries. Certainly, Saudi Arabia is a major energy exporter to both countries, to both Japan and South Korea. At the same time, both Japan and South Korea have stood with the United States and others in the international community when it comes to, enforcing sanctions on Iran and in response to Iran's international terror activities and other malign activities. But of course, for Israel, again, Japan and South Korea have good relations excellent relations, I would say, with Israel. But I would highlight, though, I mean, Iran for sure has been a major topic of conversation when we do sit down with Japan and South Korea. And in fact, when we sit down together trilaterally, we often speak about Iran and ensure that our policies are well coordinated.
Thank you. What role, ideally, should the EU play in U.S. relations with Japan, South Korea, North Korea, and China?
So the EU is a major partner with us when it comes to dealing with the North Korean nuclear and missile issues. I think we share information. We work with them very closely, and individual member countries very closely, in ensuring that we're all on the same page when it comes to enforcing sanctions. Many of the EU members have diplomatic relations with North Korea, and so we, for example, I mean the UK, Germany, many others, Sweden, and so we ensure that they use their own relations with Pyongyang to send the message of the need to denuclearize, and at that same time, we remain ready to talk. As for China, I think we're seeing increasingly countries within the EU taking a hard look at their relationship with the PRC, and taking a hard look, for example, at as they're growing their 5G networks. Do they really want companies, untrusted vendors like Huawei or ZTE be part of their 5G networks. And this is a conversation that we have with our EU partners, and very often, more often than not, in fact, they make the decision that it's probably not in their best interest to go with a vendor like Huawei when they build out their 5G networks.
Thank you. We have several questions actually coming in about your work at the State Department. The first one, how critical do you think your ability to communicate with allies in their own language, Korean and Japanese, has been? How can we ensure that foreign language skills are promoted and valued more in US schools? It is very difficult to understand a culture without speaking their language.
I agree 1000%. I am a huge fan of language learning. I'm a huge advocate of language learning. I think it's so important in our schools, and starting as early or as young as possible for our young people to pick up a language. Whether it's the standard sort of, when I was in high school, it was Spanish, French, and German. But more and more, I know schools are offering languages like Chinese, like Korean, like Japanese. It's just critical. I think it's critical as the United States, as a member of the global community. I think we have a lot of catching up to do, because so many of our neighbors and partners out there, their citizens speak multiple languages. I think it's absolutely critical for us and our citizens as well to gain that international perspective, to gain the kind of inside knowledge you can only get by stepping into another culture through the language. And so I feel very lucky that I was able to pick up some languages along the way. I feel my life has been enriched by this, and I know I was able to study as a foreign student in Japan as a young person, and so that kind of opportunity, unfortunately, right now is shut down for many, given the pandemic. But I really hope that we can get through this and we can start the kind of exchanges, people-to-people ties that are so critical to building bridges between the United States and others around the world. And it does start with languages. And so for those of you out there who are contemplating whether to use up your credits on language in school, absolutely do it, because you'll be grateful, and I think you'll find your life much more enriched by doing it.
I think thankfully BTS is helping a lot of people in the US learn different languages now. So thank goodness for them, I guess. Cultural, musical language learning. From your perspective at the State Department, do you find that bilateral agreements are leading to more trust, improved outcomes and accountability, specifically in the region you focus on? Or do you think that multilateral agreements with more complexity but more joint pressure are the way forward?
Well, I mean, we've seen examples of both. I mean, certainly our bilateral agreements with our allies, let's say security agreements with our allies in the region, Japan, Korea, Australia, has absolutely led to deepened trust, deeper understanding between our countries. At the same time, multilateral agreements like NATO have stood the test of time. I mean, we've had issues certainly involving cost sharing, but these discussions, I think, are always done in a way that hopefully will increase our ability to respond to threats, and done in a way that's respectful, but definitely I think there's a role for both multilateral and bilateral agreements.
Thank you. Would you describe the attributes needed to be a successful diplomat for the State Department?
I don't know. I think you're asking the wrong person, but I'll take a stab at it. I think ultimately it's having an open mind. I mean, a willingness to step outside your comfort zone. I think a love of travel, a love of dare I say adventure. I mean, it's been a pretty adventurous and exciting career for me. I think a desire just to understand the other, and by the other I mean the person whom you're dealing with very often comes from a completely different background, completely different life story, and so it requires, I think, some empathy, but ultimately it's also just because we're public servants. We serve our country, but at the same time, and I like to think we serve a greater global public good by promoting things like peace and stability and commerce and understanding and interactions across borders and across cultural borders as well. I think we build understanding one step at a time, and hopefully that serves not just our country but also the world community as a whole.
Thank you. What is the status of the U.S. demand that the ROK pay substantially more to support the deployment of U.S. forces to Korea?
Well, conversations about that continue. In fact, our negotiator and her Korean counterpart just had a discussion the other day about this. I mean, we believe that Korea can and should bear a more fair share of the burden of stationing U.S. forces in Korea, and so negotiations go on. Admittedly it's been frustrating that we are well beyond the deadline that we had set for ourselves, or that in fact the agreement ran out January 1st, so we're coming up on a year that we've been without an agreement. But we continue to talk, and we continue to find ways to address our differences in a way, again, that's respectful, and hopefully at the end of the day we'll increase the capability of this alliance, of this U.S.-South Korea alliance, to meet our shared challenges.
Thank you. This question might be a little bit out of your realm, but do you know the status of the 2021 Tokyo Olympics?
Well, I know that the Japanese, sincerely, the government of Japan and the people of Japan sincerely hope that it can go on. I know it was a very tough decision that Prime Minister Abe had to make to postpone it for a year, but sincerely, I sincerely hope that the show will go on, that the games will go on. I'm sure they'll look different maybe from previous games in terms of number of spectators or the various kind of tests or protocols that have to take place to ensure that they're safe and everyone, athletes and spectators, remain healthy. But at this point, I know the plan is to go on 2021, but I don't really know any more details than that.
Thank you. In about 1955, Russia agreed to withdraw from its sector in Austria and allow a democratic United Austria to be established in return for its becoming neutral by treaty. Is it possible to envisage some deal like that with China over North Korea?
Well, I mean, it's a bit different. I mean, it's a good question in that it recognizes, I think, the role that China would have in any permanent peace arrangement. But given that China isn't actually occupying any part of North Korea, it's not an exact sort of one-to-one comparison there. But China was a signatory to the armistice, along with the United States and North Korea, and so I think we'll have to sort of see how this evolves. Certainly, President Moon in South Korea has made an end of war declaration, coming up with an end of war declaration as a major goal. But I think we'll have to see. But certainly, given China's influence in that region and given China's special relationship with North Korea, I mean, they will certainly have a role to play.
Thank you. Doctors Without Borders reports major tuberculosis infections in North Korea. Add COVID to their health problems. Could poor health force the North to the bargaining table?
Well, I certainly hope that we certainly don't use humanitarian assistance as a lever or a way to pressure anybody, including North Korea. And the offer is out there. We've made it, and others have made it, to provide humanitarian assistance to North Korea for whether it's TB or COVID. And those offers have remained unanswered or unresponded to. But we're very careful about separating humanitarian assistance from politics. But yeah, we would never use that again as a lever to try and pry open the North and get them to the table.
Thank you. And this will be my final question. It's hard for democracies to pursue long-term strategic diplomatic objectives with changes of power at the top. what is the best thing we as citizens of a democracy can do to steer a coherent, rational diplomatic policy regardless of domestic political transitions?
That's a great question. I think it comes back to what we discussed a little bit earlier, and I mean, there are sort of basic values and principles that cement us with our allies. I think, as Winston Churchill once famously said, I mean, you know, England has no permanent friends but permanent interests. But I think in this case, our interests, U.S. interests, are in maintaining a network of like-minded liberal democracies, you know, who share values and who share a commitment to universal human rights, things like freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion. Something I didn't mention earlier, but you know, when we look with concern at what's going on in, say, Xinjiang with the Uyghurs. And so I think just staying true to these basic values, staying true to our allies, these are the kind of things that transcend administrations. These are the things we've seen, I think, over the course of the past several decades, from administration to administration. I mean, certainly there have been changes and some ups and downs, but for the most part, our alliance relationships with Japan, with South Korea, with Australia have remained remarkably steady since the 50s. And so I would expect that going forward, we're going to see the same, this kind of continuity and the same kind of devotion to our shared values and devotion to our friends.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Dr. Park. I'm going to turn this conversation back over to you. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you. Just very briefly, I wanted to express my thanks to Deputy Assistant Secretary Marc Knapper for his insights today, and also our gratitude for your leadership in public service. It's great to see you assume larger and larger responsibilities related to U.S. Asia policy, and certainly there are going to be a lot of challenges ahead, but I think with the experience and the relationships you bring to the table, we're in good hands. So thank you again, and thank you to the World Affairs Council, Los Angeles and Town Hall for having me here today. Thank you.
Well, thank you both.
Everybody.
Such an informative discussion. Mark and John, we so appreciate your time and your expertise, and you'll need to come back in the new year and continue this wonderful conversation. For our viewers, today is Giving Tuesday, so please help us keep these wonderful discussions ongoing, enabling civic engagement through programs just like this with experts and leaders who broaden our knowledge and our awareness. So please, text the word GIVE to the number on the screen. With your support, we will be able to serve you and our global community. We have a terrific lineup of programs that'll keep you busy between now and the end of the year. Thursday, Politics in the Time of Coronavirus with politics professor Dan Schnur. Then on December 8th, we have a program, Are International Organizations Obsolete? This is produced by our Young Professionals group. On December 9th, we have the impact of COVID on mental health with the Chicago School of Psychology. And on the 15th, California Congresswoman Karen Bass. So please visit our website, register for our programs, become a member, make a donation. Everybody stay safe, stay informed, and see you soon. John and Mark, thank you so very much again.